persistent service asset.
Part 20. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. August 16, 2026. Chapter 136. The Landing. By the time Daniel Ortega returned to the guild house, nobody was entirely sure whether he was still a corporate strategist. He dressed like one. That was the first thing Vaspar noticed. Not because the clothes were conspicuous. Quite the opposite. Ortega had perfected the peculiar uniform of the prosperous man who wanted to look as though prosperity had happened to him by accident. Soft linen jacket, collar open, trousers without a crease, old-looking shoes that were almost certainly expensive, and a watch so discreet that it announced itself only to people who knew what they were looking at. The whole effect suggested that he had spent 20 years learning how not to look as though he had spent 20 years learning anything. He carried no briefcase. Instead, he had a thin black case tucked under one arm and a cardboard tube in the other hand. He paused beneath the ghost of the old corporate logo in the guild house lobby and looked around as though returning to a building that had changed its mind since his last visit. It had. The reception area was busier than it had been when he had first encountered it. The former showroom no longer felt like an abandoned commercial space colonized by enthusiasts. It had acquired the density of an institution. People were moving through it with purpose. A woman from the food guild was carrying trays toward the courtyard. Two skyfishers were wheeling a partially disassembled aircraft toward the maintenance floor. A ground truther stood at the old reception desk arguing with a municipal surveyor over a digital map. A young technician walked past carrying a quadruped leg under one arm as casually as another person might carry an umbrella. Ortega watched all of it. He smiled. "You're making the place dangerous," he said. Vaspar, who had been waiting for him, glanced toward the workshop. "How? It looks useful." She understood the compliment. "You've brought something." "I've brought an argument." "That's worse." He smiled. "I thought you liked arguments." "I like arguments that survive contact with reality." "Then we're in luck." He looked toward the courtyard. "Is Tomas here?" "Yes." "Good." He seemed relieved. That interested her. Ortega had never seemed like a man who needed anyone's approval. But there was something different in the way he entered the guild house now. He was not arriving to sell something. He was arriving to have something tested. The meeting had been scheduled for the upper floor because there was nowhere downstairs large enough to accommodate everyone who had heard about it. That alone told Vaspar something. Ortega had sent his proposal to the guilds without giving it a name that sounded like a development project. He had called it a transition infrastructure proposal for the Aldea Zama district. That phrase had done exactly what he intended. It had made people curious. It had also made them suspicious. The upper room filled gradually. Representatives from the Robotics Guild came first, followed by the Skyfish Cooperative, the Food Guild, the architects, and the financial people. Several members of the new middle arrived together, though they no longer behaved as a block. The ground truthers sent 2 observers. The municipality sent 1 engineer and, after some hesitation, a planning official who had spent enough years dealing with developers to recognize when a presentation was about to become expensive. Vaspar sat near the sidewall. Tomas sat beside her. Ortega stood near the screen. The room was warm. Outside, clouds were building over the jungle, and the glass walls had turned the surrounding vegetation into a dark green mass. The guild house's ventilation system was working hard enough to make the papers on the tables tremble occasionally. Ortega opened the black case. Inside was a physical model. He did not immediately place it on the table. Instead, he looked around the room. "I want to begin with something I don't expect you to agree with," he said. "Aldea Zama is about to receive far more capital, expertise, and high net worth residents than its existing urban structure can comfortably absorb." Someone shifted in their chair. The planning official leaned back. Ortega continued. "I'm not saying that as a forecast. I'm saying it as an observation." He put the model on the table. It was wrapped in black fabric. When people with money arrive in sufficient numbers, they don't simply occupy housing. They generate infrastructure. They create private services. They establish informal transportation systems. They pull specialized labor toward themselves. They increase land values. They change retail patterns. They alter the economics of everything around them. A ground truther interrupted. And Ortega looked at him. And if we don't design for that pressure, the pressure will design the district for us. Nobody laughed. That was the sentence he had come prepared to defend. He removed the fabric. The model beneath it was large. The room changed. The tower was not shaped like the luxury towers already appearing around the region. It did not have the usual vertical repetition of balconies stacked above a podium, nor the decorative roofline intended to make a building look taller in photographs. It was asymmetrical, but not in the manner of architectural spectacle. The form seemed to have been assembled around functions rather than an exterior image. Its lower levels were broad and porous. Its middle rose in several offset vertical masses. Some sections were enclosed. Others were open. There were terraces at different heights, but they were not ornamental balconies. They were productive spaces. Gardens, workshops, gathering areas, observation decks, and what appeared to be agricultural infrastructure. A lattice ran up one side of the tower. The skyfish representative stood. "What is that?" Ortega looked pleased. "That's why you're here." He rotated the model. The lattice was an aerial operations spine. Landing pads were integrated into the structure at several elevations, with maintenance spaces immediately behind them. The uppermost platforms were larger. The lower ones were smaller. Cargo moved differently from people. Aircraft did not have to cross the same circulation paths as pedestrians. The entire side of the tower seemed designed to receive machines. A skyfisher walked closer. "You've put a maintenance bay behind every landing deck." "Not every deck. Enough of them." "Yes." "Where did you get this?" Ortega looked toward the skyfishers. "You did." They stared at him. "The Guild House taught us what your operation looks like when it has to improvise inside a building designed for something else." He touched the model. "I don't want the next generation of skyfishers improvising around someone else's architecture." That got their attention. The model opened. Not physically. Ortega touched the tablet beside it, and the screen displayed a sectional view. The tower disappeared. The interior became visible. The building was not a stack of apartments. It was a vertical district. Residential areas occupied some of the upper levels, but they were interwoven with communal spaces, professional facilities, workshops, and production systems. There were kitchens large enough to serve hundreds, medical facilities, learning spaces, fabrication rooms, maintenance bays, studios, offices without fixed corporate identities, meeting rooms, storage, repair facilities. The planning official stared. "This is a city." "Not quite." "What is it, then?" "A landing structure." The phrase sounded strange in the room. Ortega did not explain immediately. Instead, he enlarged the residential levels. "They will arrive," he said. "Who?" "The people we're already seeing." He looked toward the new middle. "Former executives, engineers, managers, professionals, entrepreneurs, people whose assets have appreciated faster than their social identities have adapted. People with enough money to remove themselves from ordinary economic pressure, but not necessarily enough understanding of what to do after they have done it." Nobody interrupted. Ortega had found the uncomfortable part. "Some will buy villas," he continued. "Some will buy apartments. Some will build compounds. Some will leave again. But if enough of them stay, they'll create a new layer of demand." He switched views. "This proposal gives that population somewhere to land without requiring every arrival to become another isolated development." The ground truther observer folded his arms. "You're proposing a luxury tower." Ortega looked directly at him. "I'm proposing a machine for absorbing luxury." The man frowned. Ortega continued. "The distinction matters. He walked away from the model and toward the window. The people arriving here are not simply wealthy tourists. Some of them are coming because their old world is collapsing underneath them. AI has changed the value of their expertise. Some have been compensated enormously for leaving systems that no longer need them. Others have accumulated capital precisely because they were early enough to understand what was happening. He turned. They're not all the same. Some will become investors. Some will become artists. Some will build companies. Some will become teachers. Some will become obsessed with gardening. Some will spend 2 years trying to recover from having been a senior vice president before discovering that nobody cares. There was laughter. Even the ground truther smiled. Ortega allowed it. The problem is not wealth, he said. The problem is what happens when wealth arrives without a place for people to turn it into something socially useful. He returned to the model. This building is designed to give them that place. The next section was the part that made the engineers stop treating the proposal as a luxury development. Ortega opened the lower levels. The tower continued beneath the ground. Not a parking garage. A subterranean infrastructure layer. The underground section was dense, mechanical, and almost entirely invisible from the surface. Autonomous freight. Energy storage. Water systems. Waste processing. Computing. Manufacturing support. Maintenance. Logistics. Service corridors. The surface was for people. The underground was for the systems that allowed the people to live without reproducing the logistical inefficiencies of a conventional tower. Tomas leaned forward. Ortega noticed. This is where I expect you to object. Tomas studied the model. How deep? Deep enough. That's not an engineering answer. I know. Tomas smiled. Ortega looked at him. The final depth depends on what we connect to. Tomas looked again. There was another layer beneath the infrastructure. It was not labeled. Vaspar noticed it too. What is that? Ortega did not answer immediately. He rotated the model. A narrow corridor extended from beneath the tower toward the edge of the district. It disappeared beyond the base of the model. Tomas looked at him. That's not municipal infrastructure. No. Whose is it? Ortega paused. Not ours. The room became quieter. Vaspar understood. The tower was not merely going to connect to Aldea Zama. It was designed to connect downward into the infrastructure that was beginning to form beneath the district. TLP. Not publicly. Not yet. But physically. The Food Guild became interested when Ortega opened the agricultural levels. The tower contained aeroponic growing systems integrated into several of its vertical cores. Not ornamental gardens. Production. Leaf vegetables. Herbs. Some fruits. Experimental crops. Seed storage. Water recycling. Nutrient recovery. The agricultural floors were designed around the assumption that food production belonged inside the building's infrastructure rather than somewhere beyond its walls. A Food Guild member studied the model. How much? Depends on crop selection. How much can you actually produce? Enough to matter. That's not a number. No. Ortega smiled. I'm not trying to make the tower independent of the region. The woman nodded slowly. Good. I'm trying to make the tower less dependent on supply chains that shouldn't have to exist. That answer satisfied her more. Then came manufacturing. The maker floors were not designed as hobby rooms for wealthy residents who wanted to pretend to be artisans. They were industrially serious. CNC equipment. Additive manufacturing. Electronics. Materials laboratories. Robotic fabrication. Small batch production. Repair. Reverse engineering. Prototyping. There were spaces where someone could design something upstairs and manufacture it several floors below. Or dismantle it. Or repair it. Or teach someone else how to build it. The building had been designed around the assumption that a person who owned something should be able to understand maintain or modify at least some part of it. That idea had clearly influenced Ortega more deeply than he was willing to admit. Tomas pointed toward the manufacturing floor. Who operates this? The guilds. Which ones? That's the interesting part. He enlarged the workspace. There aren't permanent assignments. Tomas looked at him. Ortega smiled. I've learned something from the guild house. What? Buildings shouldn't decide who people are. Vaspar watched him closely. There was something almost unfamiliar in Daniel Ortega now. The old corporate strategist was still there. The ability to structure an argument. The instinct for incentives. The understanding of capital. The instinctive awareness of what would make a project financially irresistible. But those tools were being redirected. He wasn't asking how to extract the maximum value from the tower. He was asking how to make the tower useful enough that people would voluntarily support it. That was different. And more dangerous. Because it meant he might succeed. The presentation continued for almost 3 hours. There was no applause. There were arguments. The Skyfishers wanted more operational space. The Food Guild wanted more agricultural capacity. The Robotics Guild wanted machine corridors separated from human circulation. The architects objected to some of the structural assumptions. The financial people questioned how the building would finance itself. The municipality wanted to know what public obligations would accompany private ownership. The ground truthers wanted guarantees that the project would not become a precedent for further land acquisition. Ortega answered almost all of them. When he couldn't, he wrote the question down. That impressed Vaspar more than his answers. He was not presenting a finished project. He was presenting a system capable of being modified by the people who would have to live with its consequences. At one point, a ground truther asked him why wealthy people should receive such extraordinary facilities. Ortega did not dodge the question. Because they're coming. The man stared at him. That's your justification? No. Ortega looked around the room. My justification is that if they're coming, we should make their arrival useful. He gestured toward the model. They will spend money. They will demand services. They will consume land. They will bring skills. They will bring expectations. They'll create jobs in some places and destroy them in others. They'll alter prices. They'll alter politics. They'll change the district whether we like it or not. He paused. So I'm proposing that we capture some of the value they're going to create and convert it into infrastructure that doesn't belong exclusively to them. The ground truther looked at the model again. How? That's the part one need you to help design. That changed the room. The project was no longer simply a development proposal. It had become an offer. Ortega was sweetening the pot deliberately. The Skyfishers would receive a serious aerial operations facility. The maker guilds would gain industrial space. The maintenance guild would gain a permanent base. The food cooperative would gain agricultural infrastructure. The professional guilds would gain offices and laboratories. The municipality would receive infrastructure without having to build all of it. The new middle would receive a place to live that did not require every newcomer to become another independent real estate project. The ground truthers would receive commitments on land pressure, transportation, and environmental boundaries. And the tower's subterranean systems would interface with the emerging TLP infrastructure. Everyone had something to gain. That was Daniel's real presentation. The model was merely the evidence. By the time the meeting ended, the sun had gone down. The guild house's interior lights came on automatically as the glass turned black. Outside, the jungle became a wall of sound. Insects. Distant traffic. A motorcycle somewhere beyond the district. The occasional high electronic whine of a drone moving through the night. Nobody left immediately. People clustered around the model. The Skyfishers were arguing about landing geometry. The Robotics Guild was examining the maintenance levels. The ground truthers had begun discussing the proposal among themselves. The municipal engineer was still staring at the underground section. Tomas remained beside the model. Vaspar came to stand next to him. You like it? He didn't answer. She waited. That's not what I expected. From Daniel? From the project? She looked at the tower. It makes the guild house look small. It is small. That's not what I meant. I know. He pointed toward the underground connection. This is the part that matters. Vaspar nodded. Yes. They watched Daniel speaking with the skyfishers. He was listening. Actually listening. Not waiting for his turn to answer. That was new. Vaspar looked at Tomas. He's learned. From whom? She smiled. Everyone. Daniel eventually came over. He looked tired. The presentation had taken something out of him. You hate it, he said. Tomas shook his head. No. Daniel looked at Vaspar. You? I haven't decided. That's encouraging. She studied him. Why here? He knew what she meant. Why build it in the center of Aldea Zama? Because that's where the pressure is. Why not somewhere cheaper? Because the people we're trying to reach are already here. That's not the whole answer. No. He looked through the glass toward the district. The lights of Aldea Zama were beginning to appear through the trees. I've spent most of my career watching people build things in the wrong place because the land was cheaper. Vaspar waited. They save money on the site and spend 10 times as much creating the infrastructure the site doesn't have. He turned back. This place already has the beginnings of an ecosystem. He gestured toward the guild house. The guilds, the skyfishers, the makers, the food people, the ground truthers, the professionals, the municipal systems, the skull. He paused. If you put the tower here, the building becomes part of that ecosystem instead of another island. Tomas looked at him. And the connection below? Daniel's expression changed slightly. That isn't my part of the project. Whose is it? Daniel held his gaze. Ask the people building it. Then he walked away. Tomas watched him go. Vaspar said nothing. Neither did he. Later that night, after the guild house had emptied, the model remained on the central table. The building was dark except for the emergency lighting. The tower stood there in miniature, its vertical gardens, landing decks and production spaces frozen beneath the light. It looked less like a luxury building now, more like a piece of infrastructure waiting to be inhabited. Beneath it, hidden inside the model, a narrow tunnel extended toward the edge of the district. Nobody had labeled it. Nobody needed to. The guild house had begun as a room. The skull had begun as an infrastructure proposition. The tower was becoming something else. A place designed to absorb a demographic shock. A place for people whose old professional identities were collapsing. A place where capital could be converted into capability. A place where luxury could subsidize transition. The doctrine behind it had never imagined a conventional safety net. It imagined a landing structure for people whose old engine of employment was not coming back, and a social environment in which displaced expertise could become stewardship rather than credentialed status. At its center was the idea that collective meaning could be organized through participation, with AI serving translation, connection, simulation, and institutional memory rather than replacing human judgment. Daniel had taken those ideas and given them a location, not a campus at the edge of somewhere. A vertical district in the middle of Aldea Zama. And beneath the building, where no future resident would see it from a balcony or brochure, another infrastructure was waiting to meet it. The tower had not yet been approved. The land had not yet been assembled. The financing had not yet been closed. The engineering was incomplete. The political fight had barely begun. But the idea had entered the guild house. That was how things happened here. Someone brought in a machine. Someone brought in an argument. Someone brought in a problem. And if the building could not contain it, they changed the building. Chapter 137. The Price of Being Useful. The proposal did not become controversial until people understood that it might actually work. For 3 days after Daniel Ortega's presentation, the Guild House behaved as though someone had introduced a new machine into the building, and everyone was waiting to discover what it was capable of breaking. The tower had ceased to be Daniel's project almost immediately. People were drawing on its plans, arguing over its dimensions, questioning its assumptions, and, in one memorable case, placing a coffee cup on the architectural model to demonstrate where the public market ought to be. Daniel had deliberately left the model behind. That was the first thing Vaspar noticed when she came down early on the 4th morning. The second was that nobody had left it alone. The original model still stood on the long work table beneath the windows, but it had acquired an additional skin of annotations. Small pieces of colored tape marked Skyfish landing decks. Someone had drawn arrows through the maintenance floors. The agricultural levels were covered with tiny green tabs. The Robotics Guild had placed 3 miniature machines beside the base. A member of the food cooperative had attached a handwritten note to the sun-facing facade. "This is not decoration." Below it, somebody else had added, "Good." Vaspar stood over the model with her coffee and tried to see the building as Daniel had first presented it. She couldn't. The tower had become more interesting. It was still tall, still ambitious, still unmistakably designed to accommodate people with more money than most of the surrounding population would ever see in a bank account. But the architecture no longer read as a vertical luxury development. The building had acquired a strange social density. It seemed to contain several different ideas of what a city could be, compressed into one structure and forced to negotiate with one another. The lower levels were porous and public. Manufacturing and repair occupied large sections. Food production climbed the sunward side. The Skyfish infrastructure had expanded until it looked almost like a second skeleton attached to the building. Residential levels had been subdivided into radically different forms. Generous apartments for residents who wanted them, adaptable units for families and professionals, communal living areas, and an entire floor that Daniel had barely mentioned during the presentation. That floor had become the subject of the most argument. Hundreds of narrow tubes, Spartan sleeping accommodations, cheap enough that somebody passing through Aldea Zama for a month could afford one without turning their entire trip into a financial calculation. Each tube was self-cleaning, mechanically ventilated, digitally keyed, and designed to require almost nothing from the occupant except that they enter it and sleep. They looked ridiculous in the model. They also looked strangely practical. A technician had written beside them, "Why does a millionaire need to live here?" Someone had answered, "The millionaire doesn't." Vaspar smiled. She heard Tomas behind her. "You've been here all night." "Not all night." He looked at the model. "Who changed this?" "Everyone." "That's not a very useful answer." "It wasn't intended to be." He handed her a second coffee. Tomas had become accustomed to the Guild House in ways he still didn't quite understand. He moved through it with the unconscious confidence of someone whose body recognized the arrangement of spaces before his conscious mind did. The workshops, the narrow stairs, the service corridors, the smell of warm electronics and machine oil, the sounds of people working in different rooms without any centralized announcement telling them what they were supposed to be doing. The place was becoming an organism. That was why Daniel's tower mattered. It was not proposing to duplicate the Guild House. It was proposing to take what was happening here and ask what it would look like if it had to absorb several thousand people. Tomas looked at the model again. "Daniel's coming." "When?" "Now." "How do you know?" "I saw him outside." Vaspar looked toward the entrance. Daniel Ortega came through the southern service door carrying a roll of engineering drawings beneath one arm and a paper cup in the other hand. He was dressed almost exactly as he had been for the original presentation. Pale linen jacket, open collar, trousers that seemed deliberately uninterested in creasing, old-looking shoes that were almost certainly expensive. But the clothes were no longer quite as convincing. There was dirt on one shoe. His jacket was wrinkled. The sleeve had been pushed up on one arm. He looked less like a man who had dressed to appear poor and more like a wealthy man who had discovered that construction sites did not care what he was wearing. Vaspar liked him better that way. Daniel saw the model. He stopped. What happened? Vaspar pointed toward the table. You left it unattended. I see that. The building has been improved. Daniel walked closer. He examined the modifications. Someone had added a gym, not a private fitness club. A real athletic complex distributed around the central atrium, with climbing walls, suspended apparatus, running tracks, and open training areas. The atrium itself had been redrawn as a vast climate-controlled garden, its vegetation rising through several floors beneath filtered sunlight. The public park that occupied the center had been designed to serve children during the day and adults whenever they needed to become children again, but its climbing structures and open spaces could also function as emergency training grounds, rescue practice areas, and physical conditioning facilities. Daniel studied it. Who did this? Everyone, Vaspar said. He nodded. Good. He sounded sincere. That was important. The meeting began before 9 and immediately exceeded the room. People arrived from the Skyfish Cooperative, the Food Guild, robotics, maintenance, architecture, finance, municipal planning, and the ground truthers. Several residents from the surrounding district came because they had heard rumors about the tower. A few transient workers came because someone had told them there would be cheap accommodation inside it. They were the ones who asked the most direct questions. One young woman wanted to know whether the sleeping tubes would actually be cheap or merely cheap by luxury development standards. Daniel answered her without hesitation. Cheap enough that the price doesn't become the reason you can't stay. She nodded. That's different. Yes. Another man asked whether the tubes were intended for workers only. No. Then who? Anyone who needs them. Even residents? Especially residents. Daniel pointed to the model. The idea is to remove the assumption that every person has to solve their housing needs with the same amount of space. The tube floor had originally been conceived as a practical answer to temporary accommodation. But as the architects worked through it, its implications had become larger. Someone might live in a tube for 3 nights while visiting the district. Another might use one for 6 months while working on a project. A young person might prefer it permanently. An elderly resident might use one during a renovation. A couple might arrive with enough money to rent a large apartment and discover that they actually preferred the communal floor. The tubes were deliberately unglamorous. No granite. No spa bathroom. No view. Clean, quiet place to sleep. The luxury was elsewhere. The luxury was having a building in which you could choose. The underlying doctrine Daniel was adapting had never treated the transition environment as a temporary welfare shelter. It was conceived as a landing structure for people whose old employment identities might not return, with housing, food, healthcare, community, maintenance, and meaningful participation providing a material surface from which a different life could be constructed. Daniel had taken that principle and removed some of its abstraction. He was putting sleeping tubes in a tower. He opened the first set of drawings. This is the version I want you to attack. The architects laughed. You don't want approval? I want problems. That's a strange business model. It's cheaper than discovering them after construction. He spread the plans across the table. The building was organized around a series of vertical systems rather than a conventional stack of floors. At the center was the atrium. It was enormous. The architects had originally called it a public courtyard because they had not known what else to call it. The term had survived despite the fact that it extended upward through much of the building and was enclosed by a transparent climate control envelope. Daniel preferred to call it a park. Not a lobby. Not an atrium. Park. The distinction was more than semantic. The floor was living terrain. Trees grew in large planting beds. Vines climbed structural frames. Water circulated through shallow channels. There were shaded areas, open spaces, and elevated paths. Climbing walls rose along the inner surfaces of the building, some of them intended for children, others tall enough for serious adult training. There were ropes, platforms, suspended walkways, soft landing surfaces, exercise structures, places where a child could spend an afternoon without being told they were participating in an educational program. Places where an adult could train for climbing, rescue operations, or simple physical competence without having to join a private club. The same terrain could be playful or serious depending on who entered it. Daniel enlarged the section. During ordinary operation, it's a public park. The robotics engineer looked at him. And during an emergency, it becomes a training ground. For whom? Everyone. That answer caused more discussion than Daniel expected. A municipal planner pointed toward the climbing structures. You want the public using emergency infrastructure as recreation? I want people familiar with the environment before they need it. The planner considered this. It made sense. The building's philosophy was beginning to emerge in physical form. Infrastructure should not disappear into the background until it was needed. People should know how systems worked because they encountered them in ordinary life. The atrium was therefore not simply beautiful. It was legible. Children climbed it. Adults exercised in it. Visitors wandered through it. Rescue teams trained in it. Maintenance workers inspected it. People grew food beside it. The building's functions overlapped rather than occupying sealed compartments. The sun-facing facade was next. This was where Daniel had initially made the mistake of calling the greenery a thermal skin. The Food Guild had corrected him. It isn't a skin, one of them said. It's a field. Daniel looked at her. She pointed toward the model. Skin protects what's inside. This produces something. The revised facade contained layers of vegetation and food production systems arranged around the building's solar exposure. Aeroponic towers, shaded growing corridors, climbing plants, leafy greens, herbs, experimental crops, small fruiting systems, water recovery, nutrient recovery. The greenery mitigated solar gain while producing food, and the architecture allowed maintenance robots to move along dedicated tracks between growing zones. The robots were not humanoid. They did not need to be. Small machines moved horizontally along service rails, while others climbed vertical maintenance tracks. Their harvesting tools could identify mature produce and remove it without damaging the plant. Sensors monitored moisture, nutrient concentration, temperature, and disease indicators. The machines would do the repetitive work. People would decide what to grow. That distinction pleased the Food Guild. A member of the cooperative looked toward Daniel. How much food? Enough to matter. Still not a number. Daniel smiled. I'll give you the number when the agronomists stop changing the crop mix. Fair. The greenery also cooled the building. That mattered in Aldea Zama. The facade was not attempting to defeat the climate. It was using the climate. Shade. Evaporation. Vegetation. Air movement. Water. Sunlight. The tower would remain mechanically conditioned, but the machines would not be asked to carry the entire thermal burden alone. The building was beginning to behave like something that understood where it had been built. The gym complex was Daniel's favorite addition. He had not designed it. The residents had. It occupied several levels around the atrium and included conventional training equipment, weight areas, calisthenic structures, climbing facilities, mobility rooms, recovery spaces, and open floors that could be reconfigured for classes, martial arts, dance, or whatever new physical obsession happened to pass through Aldea Zama that month. A municipal engineer asked why so much space was being dedicated to exercise. Daniel looked surprised. Because people have bodies. The room laughed. He continued. And because physical competence becomes more valuable when machines handle more of the routine work. Tomas watched him. That was a subtle shift in Daniel's thinking. The building wasn't intended to make humans competitive with machines. It was intended to make humans more human in the presence of machines. People could climb because climbing was useful. They could train because strength mattered. They could play because play mattered. They could learn to repair something because understanding one's environment mattered. The tower was not trying to preserve the old world. It was trying to preserve the parts of being alive that the old world had sometimes neglected. The amenities accumulated as the meeting continued. A public thermal circuit, a communal kitchen, a market, a repair bazaar, a tool library, clinic, quiet rooms, music spaces, a small cinema, children's discovery areas, a public library, a laundry that was deliberately pleasant, a night market capable of opening toward the surrounding district, a rooftop observation garden, shared workshops, a sound studio, guest rooms, small offices that could be rented by the hour, meeting spaces that belonged to no company, a place to sit without being required to buy anything. That last one caused more discussion than the architects expected. A banker asked who would pay for it. Daniel looked at him. Not everything has to. The banker stared. Daniel continued. The tower has revenue engines, residential units, commercial space, manufacturing, professional services, hospitality, events, energy, logistics. But if every square meter has to justify itself by charging someone, we will have built another shopping center. That was the line that finally made Vaspar understand what Daniel was attempting. He was not merely applying the 1% doctrine to architecture. He was trying to make luxury finance a cross-subsidy mechanism for civic infrastructure. The original doctrine had imagined luxury development redirecting a portion of the wealth generated by automation toward transition infrastructure, effectively making high-value development a transition engine rather than merely an extraction mechanism. Daniel had pushed the principle further. He wanted the luxury residents to pay for things they would use, and things they would never use. The building's economics would carry the public functions. The wealthy resident did not need to be charitable. They simply needed to be willing to live in a building whose business model included the existence of other people. That was a much easier proposition to sell. The hardest conversation came from the ground truthers. They had listened quietly through most of the presentation. Then one of them stood. "You've made a wonderful building." Daniel waited. "That's the problem." A few people laughed. The ground truther did not. "Everything you've shown us is a reason to build it." He pointed toward the windows. "Nothing you've shown us is a reason not to destroy the district around it." Daniel nodded. "That's fair. People will come. Yes. They'll pay more. Yes. Land prices rise. Yes. People who are already here get pushed out." Daniel looked at the model. "Unless we design the project to absorb some of that pressure." "How?" "Density." The ground truther frowned. Daniel explained. "If the people coming here can live vertically, work vertically, manufacture vertically, grow food vertically, receive services vertically, and move through the district without every household demanding another vehicle route, another villa, another parking area, and another private compound, the land pressure is different." The ground truther shook his head. "Different isn't less." "No." Daniel met his eyes. "But it can be managed." The man remained silent. Daniel continued. "I'm not going to promise you that this project has no consequences. It will. Every large project does. What I can promise is that those consequences will be part of the design rather than an externality we pretend doesn't exist." Vaspar watched the ground truther. He wasn't convinced. But he was listening. That was enough. The question of the road returned. The original access route was still impossible. Daniel's engineers had marked it in red. A narrow corridor crossed land occupied by people whose relationship to the property system was complicated, partly formal and partly historical. They had lived there, worked there, built there, and in some cases been there long enough that the legal status of their occupation was less useful than the physical fact of their presence. The tower could not simply draw a line through them. Daniel knew that. The ground truthers knew that. The municipality knew it. The problem was that the tower still needed access. The solution came from Tomas. He stood over the map for several minutes before speaking. Stop thinking of the tower as the destination. Daniel looked at him. Go on. Make it the interchange. He explained the idea. The conventional road could terminate before the most sensitive terrain. People could transfer to autonomous mobility. Goods could move through an underground logistics corridor. Skyfish could handle light and urgent cargo. Quadrupeds could carry supplies through designated terrain routes. Pedestrians could walk. The tower would not demand that the landscape accommodate every conventional vehicle. It would accommodate the landscape. Daniel looked at the map. The ground truthers looked at each other. One of them finally nodded. That could work. The robotics engineer objected. Could. The ground truther smiled. That's the most honest word anyone has used today. The underground section was where the project became something else. Daniel opened the lower plans. The tower extended beneath the surface into an automated infrastructure layer. Not a basement. Not a parking structure. An underground city. Autonomous logistics. Energy. Waste. Water. Storage. Maintenance. Computing. Freight transfer. Machine circulation. The human surface could therefore remain relatively open, green and social because the ugly work of moving things had been moved below. That division came directly from the 1% doctrine's conception of an automated substrate beneath the human environment. Machines handle logistics while the surface is reserved for participation, community, and meaning. Tomas studied the plan. How deep? Deep enough. That's not an engineering answer. It's the answer before we know the geology. Better. The lower plan continued beyond the tower. A narrow corridor extended toward the edge of the district. It was not labeled. Vaspar noticed. What is that? Daniel looked at the drawing. Future infrastructure. Whose? Daniel hesitated. Not mine. Tomas stared at him. You're building toward TLP. Daniel didn't answer. The room had become very quiet. He eventually said, I'm building a structure that won't prevent the district from connecting to whatever infrastructure the district eventually chooses. Vaspar watched him. That's carefully phrased. It's deliberately phrased. The distinction mattered. The tower could not presume TLP's sovereignty, could not assume the political outcome, but it could avoid becoming a dead end. The connection was therefore designed into the building without being politically declared. The tower was being built with a socket. Nobody had yet decided exactly what would plug into it. The cheap sleeping floor became unexpectedly important. Daniel had expected it to be dismissed as an oddity. Instead, it became one of the most discussed features. The accommodations were arranged in dense banks, each tube large enough for a person to sleep comfortably, store a small amount of personal equipment, and maintain privacy. Cleaning was automated. Linens were handled by a shared system. Ventilation was individually controlled within narrow limits. The floor had showers, lockers, communal kitchens, lounges, and quiet rooms. There were no prestige views, no private balconies, no marble, no decorative excess. It was deliberately cheap. A resident could spend money elsewhere. A transient could avoid spending money altogether. An apprentice could live there. A skyfisher between contracts could live there. A visiting artist could live there. A researcher could live there. A family member visiting someone in the tower could use it. Someone newly arrived in Aldea Zama could spend a month there before deciding what their life was supposed to become. That last use interested Vaspar. She asked Daniel about it privately after the meeting. Why hundreds? Because hundreds of people need somewhere to sleep. You could make more money using the floor for luxury apartments. I know. Then why don't you? Daniel looked toward the model. Because the building needs a door. She waited. The tower can have the best infrastructure in the district, but if the only people who can enter it are people who can afford to buy their way inside, we've built another enclave. He touched the model. The tubes are the door. The atrium was almost empty by the time the meeting ended. Most of the people had gone downstairs for dinner. Vaspar remained beside the model. She could see the building now, not as a rendering, as a place. Children moving through the atrium. A maintenance robot harvesting basil several floors above. A skyfish landing on an upper deck. Someone repairing a bicycle. A group of former executives sitting beside apprentices in the communal kitchen. A woman climbing a wall while her child watched from below. Someone sleeping in a tube because they had arrived with one backpack and no reason to pretend otherwise. A technician descending into the underground maintenance level. A group of people gathering in the park for an evening performance. A quadruped moving through a service corridor. The building contained contradictions that would have been unacceptable in a conventional luxury development. That was precisely why it might work. Tomas came to stand beside her. You like it? I do. That's dangerous. Why? You've been criticizing everything Daniel does. I haven't. You have. I've been testing him. And… She looked at the model. He passed. Tomas smiled. That's almost romantic. Don't start. They both laughed. Daniel returned from downstairs. He looked exhausted. Vaspar watched him approach. You realize they have redesigned your building. I noticed. You don't mind. Not at all. You may not recognize it when they're finished. Daniel looked at the model. That's the point. He sat down. For several minutes, none of them spoke. The guild house was quieter now. The workshops were still operating, but the voices had diminished. The courtyard lights had come on. Through the glass, the jungle was turning black. Daniel leaned forward. I thought I was designing housing. Vaspar looked at him. And now? A system. Tomas shook his head. No. Daniel looked at him. An ecosystem. Daniel considered that, then nodded. Yes. He looked at the tower. The difficult part is going to be convincing people that the luxury isn't the apartments. Vaspar smiled. What is it? Everything else. The first serious objection arrived the next morning. Not from the municipality. Not from the ground truthers. Not from developers. From a resident who had never attended one of Daniel's meetings. She left a handwritten note at the guild house. It was brief. She had seen the model. She had heard about the tower. She understood the cheap accommodation. She understood the public park. She understood the food production. She understood the skyfish facilities. She understood the workshops. Then she wrote, Who gets to decide what the building is for? Daniel read the note twice. He did not dismiss it. Instead, he took it upstairs. The dream catcher concept had always been intended to replace the idea that a transition campus could simply prescribe a future to its inhabitants. The underlying model called for collective refinement, community endorsement, participation, maintenance commitments, and ongoing stewardship, with AI serving translation, connection, simulation, and institutional memory rather than making the decisions itself. Daniel stared at the note, then at the model, then at Vaspar. We don't have an answer. Good. He looked at her. Good. If you already had the answer, we'd have another corporate building. He folded the note. We need a governance layer. Yes. Before construction. Yes. Daniel looked toward the courtyard. The guild house was already demonstrating one possible answer. Not perfectly. Not elegantly. But continuously. People came. They argued. They changed things. They accepted consequences. They maintained what they had changed. The tower would need something similar, perhaps more formal, perhaps less forgiving, but not imposed from above. Daniel put the note beside the architectural plans. For the first time, the project had acquired something no rendering could provide. A question that could not be answered by design. That evening, Daniel walked the future site alone. The proposed footprint was still mostly jungle and disturbed ground. There was no tower, no atrium, no skyfish landing deck, no agricultural facade, no sleeping tubes, no underground logistics system, only earth. A few survey markers, a temporary fence, trees, heat. The ordinary sounds of Aldea Zama continuing around it. He stood there for a long time. The tower existed only in drawings and arguments. Yet the project had already begun changing the district. People were talking about access, about food, about housing, about who deserved infrastructure, about whether wealth could be made to subsidize something larger than itself, about whether a building could belong to a community before it was finished. Daniel looked toward the distant lights. Somewhere beyond them was the guild house. Beyond that, the skull. Beyond that, infrastructure nobody had yet formally named as sovereign. He had spent most of his career working in systems where buildings were assets and people were variables. He was beginning to suspect that the order had been backwards. The tower would still make money. It had to. It would still contain luxury. It had to, if the economics were to work. It would still attract people with extraordinary resources. That was unavoidable. But if those resources could be made to circulate through the building rather than simply accumulate behind private doors, then the tower could become something more useful than another monument to wealth. It could become a place where wealth was forced to encounter competence, where luxury financed infrastructure, where children climbed walls beside retired executives, where a transient worker could sleep cheaply beneath the same roof as someone who had arrived with a family office, where food grew on the facade, where machines harvested it, where skyfishers maintained aircraft above the atrium, where people learned to repair what they owned, where a park doubled as a training ground, where the underground city moved things so the surface could remain human. And beneath all of it, a connection waited for a political future that nobody could yet guarantee. Daniel looked down at the survey marker beneath his shoe. The building was not there, but the negotiation had begun. That was enough. Chapter 138. The people who would have to live with it. The first thing that happened after Daniel's revised proposal was not approval. It was a queue. People began arriving at the guild house carrying things they wanted to put into the tower. Not money. Not architectural plans. Things. A woman from the food cooperative arrived with a list of crops she wanted grown on the sunward facade. A skyfisher brought a maintenance schematic covered in handwritten notes. Two transient workers arrived together because they had heard about the sleeping tubes and wanted to know whether cheap meant cheap enough to be real. A teacher wanted a place where children could learn to build things without being separated from the people actually building them. A musician asked whether the sound rooms could be designed so that somebody practicing at 2 in the afternoon would not become everybody else's problem. A maintenance technician wanted service corridors wide enough for 2 machines to pass without one having to reverse. Someone from the neighborhood arrived carrying a folding chair. He did not ask for anything. He sat down. Vaspar noticed him because he stayed for 3 hours. When she finally asked why, he shrugged. "I want to see who comes." That was becoming the problem. The tower had escaped Daniel's presentation and become a public object before there was even a foundation. People were beginning to project themselves into it. That was precisely what the 1% doctrine had assumed a transition environment should permit. Not a prescribed program telling displaced people what they were supposed to become, but a material environment capable of supporting participation while people figured out what contribution might mean after the old professional hierarchy had lost its authority. Daniel had not expected that process to begin before construction. He was discovering that architecture could become social infrastructure while still existing only on paper. He was also discovering why architects usually preferred clients to make decisions quickly. By the end of the week, the Guild House had established an unofficial office for the tower. Consisted of one table. There was no receptionist, no application process, no sign. People simply sat down and started talking. Daniel objected to calling it a consultation office. "It's not consultation," he said. "What is it?" "I don't know yet." Vaspar looked at him. "You're building a building and you don't know what the office is called." "I'm learning." "That's reassuring. It's supposed to be." He sat down opposite her. The table was already covered with notes. The tube accommodations had become one of the most requested features. People liked the idea for reasons Daniel had not anticipated. Some liked the affordability. Some liked the anonymity. Others liked the possibility of living without accumulating possessions. A woman who had arrived in Aldea Zama 6 weeks earlier had written, "I want a place where I can sleep without having to explain why I'm here." Daniel had kept that note. Another said, "Make the tubes good enough that people choose them. Don't make them good enough only for people who have no choice." That one he had underlined. The distinction mattered. If the tubes became a disguised poverty floor, the tower would reproduce the hierarchy it claimed to be dissolving. If they became genuinely desirable because they were efficient, private, clean, and connected to everything else, they could become something different. A form of voluntary simplicity. Daniel added a note to the architectural brief. "No second-class infrastructure." Then he stared at it. Vaspar noticed. "You don't believe that." "I do. You've just created a requirement you don't know how to finance." "Yes." She smiled. "You're learning." The financial model was where the romance of the project met its first serious wall. Daniel presented the revised numbers in a room that had once been used for corporate product launches. The old ceiling still contained recessed lighting arranged for presentations to people who had once been expected to applaud at predetermined moments. The lights had been disconnected years ago, but the wiring remained, and someone had recently repurposed the channels to carry power to a bank of small servers. Daniel stood beneath them with a projection behind him. "This version costs more." Nobody looked surprised. "The agricultural system costs more. The atrium costs more. The public gym and park cost more. The manufacturing floors cost more. The sleeping accommodations produce less revenue per square meter than conventional residential space. The logistics infrastructure costs more to build but reduces operating costs later." A financier raised a hand. "How much less revenue?" Daniel gave the number. The financier whistled. "You're giving away the most valuable floor." "No." "You're charging below market." "Yes." "That's the same thing." "No." Daniel enlarged another part of the model. The tube floor increases occupancy, creates transient demand, supports guild operations, and makes the building accessible to people who otherwise wouldn't enter it. The financier frowned. "That's social value. It's also foot traffic, which isn't revenue. It becomes revenue when those people use the building." The financier shook his head. "You're assuming the building's economy is local." Daniel smiled. "Exactly." He brought up the manufacturing floors. Workshops generate fees. Maintenance generates fees. Professional spaces generate fees. Agricultural production generates food revenue. The market generates rents. The skyfish facilities generate operational revenue. Events generate revenue. The thermal and gym facilities generate membership revenue, but with public access windows. The residences carry the largest margin. He paused. And the public functions increase the value of the private ones. The financier leaned back. "That's the trick." "No." Daniel looked at him. "That's the architecture." The distinction was becoming central to the entire proposal. Daniel was not trying to make the tower charitable. Charity depended on surplus. The tower was supposed to make interdependence profitable. The expensive apartments would subsidize less expensive accommodation. The commercial floors would subsidize public spaces. The skyfish infrastructure would serve both private and district logistics. The agricultural systems would reduce food dependency while creating a visible public amenity. The manufacturing floors would generate income while making the building more resilient. The gym and park would attract residents and visitors while functioning as emergency infrastructure. The atrium would create real estate value precisely because it was not monetized entirely. The building's most valuable asset might eventually be the fact that it did not behave like a building full of isolated assets. Daniel knew how strange that sounded. He also knew where the money came from. The arriving population had it. The question was whether the architecture could persuade that population to spend it in a way that strengthened the district rather than merely raising the price of living in it. That was the 1% proposition stripped of doctrine and reduced to a development strategy. Luxury as transition engine. Not because luxury people were morally superior. Because luxury capital had already arrived. Daniel intended to make it pay for the landing surface beneath it. The first public tour was accidental. A family from Mexico City came to the Guild House because they were considering buying property nearby. They had heard about the tower and asked if they could see the model. Vaspar was about to tell them that the project wasn't open for tours. Daniel stopped her. Let them see it. The family gathered around the table. The father studied the residential levels. The mother was interested in the gardens. Their teenage daughter immediately found the climbing walls. Can I do that? The architect looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded. Eventually. She frowned. Why eventually? Because it's still drawings. She considered this. Then make it faster. Daniel laughed. Her father looked embarrassed. She's been climbing since she was 8. Good, Daniel said. She'll be useful. The daughter looked at him suspiciously. Useful how? Daniel thought for a moment. That's what the building is for you to find out. She seemed satisfied with the answer. Vaspar watched her move toward the atrium section. The tower was already doing something Daniel had not planned. It was allowing people to imagine themselves inside it without being told what they were supposed to become. That afternoon, the first serious disagreement about the park emerged. The architects wanted the central atrium to remain visually clean. The skyfishers wanted training structures. The parents wanted safety. The climbers wanted difficulty. The emergency planners wanted obstacles. The children wanted all of it. The solution was to make the environment reconfigurable. Climbing walls could change configuration. Training surfaces could be rearranged. Rope systems could be deployed for rescue exercises. Soft barriers could be moved. Sections could be opened or closed. The climate control system could create different conditions. Not artificial weather for entertainment. Heat, humidity, and airflow could be adjusted for training. A firefighter could practice in controlled heat. A rescue team could practice low-visibility navigation. A child could climb beneath a tree canopy. A skyfisher could practice emergency procedures around aerial equipment. A robotics technician could test machines on uneven terrain. The park became a kind of indoor civic wilderness. That phrase came from Tomas. Daniel wrote it down. He did not use it in the proposal. It sounded too much like a marketing slogan. But he kept it. The skyfishers demanded their own meeting. They did not want to be treated as an amenity. That was the word they used. Don't make us an amenity. Daniel understood immediately. The tower's aerial infrastructure could easily become a luxury service. Private drone deliveries, premium transport, rooftop arrivals for residents who didn't want to use the street. The skyfishers wanted the opposite. They wanted the building to recognize aerial logistics as a public utility. Their facilities therefore had to include training, maintenance, fabrication, storage, dispatch, and cooperative governance. The landing decks needed to support district operations. The tower couldn't reserve its airspace for wealthy residents. Daniel agreed. Then they asked for something more. A skyfish school. Not a classroom. A place where anyone could learn the basics of aerial systems, from maintenance to piloting to navigation to safety. Daniel looked at the proposal. How many people? As many as we can handle. That's not a number. It will be. He smiled. You've been spending too much time with me. The skyfisher grinned. You're contagious. The Food Guild made a similar demand. They wanted the agricultural floors to be accessible, not merely visible through glass. People needed to be able to enter them. Children needed to see where food came from. Adults needed to learn. Residents needed to understand how much work went into maintaining biological systems even when robots performed most of the labor. The agricultural floors therefore became part farm, part laboratory, part public garden. The robots would do the harvesting. Humans would do the judgment. That division became one of the tower's quiet principles. Machines could monitor. Machines could calculate. Machines could harvest. Machines could clean. But decisions about what mattered remained social. The 1% framework had explicitly assigned AI a role in translation, connection, simulation, and memory while leaving collective judgment with the community. Daniel realized that the tower's physical architecture could embody the same division. The machines could operate the substrate. The people could decide what the substrate was for. Then came the maintenance guild. Their representative was a woman named Elena who had spent enough years repairing buildings to distrust architects on principle. She looked at Daniel's plans for almost an hour before speaking. You're designing this thing to be impossible to maintain. Daniel frowned. How? Too many systems. That's why they're modular. Modular isn't magic. No. Every one of these systems will eventually fail. Yes. Every one of them will need parts. Yes. Some parts won't exist anymore. Then we'll manufacture them. On which floor? Daniel looked at the plan. She pointed. There. He nodded. Good. She pointed somewhere else. And that one. Local fabrication. That one. Same. She stared at him. You actually listened. I've been listening. That's unusual. From architects? From men who have budgets. Daniel smiled. How bad is it? She leaned back. If you want this building to last 50 years, you have to design it as though the manufacturer of every component will disappear. Daniel wrote it down. That sentence would eventually become one of the tower's engineering principles. Assume the supplier dies. Not literally. Institutionally. Companies disappear. Products change. Standards evolve. Licenses expire. Platforms shut down. The building had to survive the disappearance of its original ecosystem. That was what maintenance meant. Not keeping something new. Keeping something useful after the people who made it had moved on. The political problem arrived at dusk. A municipal official came to the guild house carrying a folder. He found Daniel in the courtyard. We need to talk. About the tower? About everything around it. Daniel gestured toward the empty chair. The official sat. He opened the folder. The city is receiving inquiries. From developers. Naturally. They want to know whether this project has preferential access to infrastructure. It doesn't. They want to know whether the tower will receive special zoning. It shouldn't. They want to know whether the TLP connection gives it an advantage. Daniel was silent. The official watched him. I don't need the political answer. What do you need? The engineering answer. Daniel looked toward the tower model visible through the glass. The building is being designed to connect. To TLP. To future infrastructure. That's not the same answer. No. The official closed the folder. You're creating a problem. Daniel nodded. I know. Do you know how big? No. The official stood. Good. He smiled faintly. Neither do I. Then he left. Later that night, Vaspar found Tomas in the workshop. He was looking at a small map. What is it? The access network. She came closer. The map showed the guild house, the proposed tower, the skull, and several other nodes. What are you seeing? Connections. That's obvious. No. He pointed. Look at the redundancy. She did. There were several possible routes. Some above ground. Some below. Some aerial. Some autonomous. Some human. The network was becoming resilient without anyone having explicitly designed it as a whole. That disturbed him. Vaspar saw why. Nobody is coordinating it. Exactly. Maybe they don't need to. Tomas looked at her. That's what worries me. They stood there in the workshop while the building settled around them. Machines entered low power states. Fans slowed. The last Skyfish aircraft was secured. The atrium lights dimmed. The guild house had always been a collection of independent initiatives. Now those initiatives were beginning to depend on one another. The tower would intensify that process. The skull would intensify it further. The emerging TLP infrastructure would intensify it beyond anything Aldea Zama's existing institutions had been built to understand. None of that required a secret master plan. It required only people solving local problems. A better way to move things. A better way to grow food. A better place to sleep. A better way to repair machines. A better way to train. A better way to share space. A better way to make money without extracting everything from the place that generated it. The danger was that local solutions could become a system before anyone had decided who governed the system. Tomas looked toward Vaspar. That's the part nobody is talking about. She knew exactly what he meant. The tower. No. He folded the map. The thing underneath it. At almost midnight, Daniel returned to the model. He had stopped sleeping properly. He stood alone in the guild house, the building quiet around him. The model's tiny lights were still on. The atrium glowed. The agricultural facade was represented by thin green strips. The Skyfish decks looked like small shelves projecting from the upper structure. The tube floor was almost invisible from outside. The underground infrastructure disappeared beneath the base. Daniel picked up the note asking who would decide what the building was for. He read it again. Then he turned it over. On the back he wrote, "Not me." He placed it beside the model. For a while he simply stood there. Then a light appeared outside. A Skyfish aircraft crossing the district. It moved silently above the trees. Another light followed. Then another. The building on the table was still imaginary. The district around it was not. And somewhere beneath that district, systems were already being connected without waiting for a ribbon-cutting ceremony, a government decree, or a developer's signature. Daniel looked down at the tiny tower. He had originally imagined it as a way of managing the arrival of wealth. He was beginning to understand that its more difficult task would be managing interdependence. The wealthy would arrive. The displaced would arrive. The transient would arrive. The guilds would expand. The machines would multiply. The district would become more capable. And capability, once distributed through physical infrastructure, was very difficult to put back into a box. Daniel switched off the model. The atrium went dark. The underground layer remained illuminated for another few seconds before the system shut itself down. Then the guild house returned to darkness, with only the faint mechanical hum of the building continuing through the night. Chapter 139. The people who had nowhere to go. The first person to arrive at the guild house looking for one of Daniel Ortega's sleeping tubes was not poor. That was what made the argument difficult. She was 43, recently divorced, professionally accomplished, financially comfortable and exhausted enough that she had begun measuring her life in hotel nights. She had spent the previous 18 months moving between Mexico City, Miami, Montreal, and Madrid, carrying 2 suitcases and a laptop while attempting to determine whether she still wanted the career that had made the rest of her life possible. She had no interest in charity. She had even less interest in being called displaced. She wanted somewhere she could close a door. The tube accommodations had caught her attention because they offered something none of the expensive apartments she had toured could provide: the ability to occupy almost no space while keeping the option of participating in everything around her. She sat across from Daniel in the Guild House's improvised project office and told him this without embarrassment. "I don't want a condominium." Daniel listened. "I've owned houses. I've rented apartments. I've had a penthouse. I've had a place in the mountains. I don't want another place that expects me to furnish it before it will admit that I'm living there." Daniel leaned back. "What do you want?" "A room I can sleep in, a shower, somewhere to put my things, somewhere I can work if I need to. Everything else can be outside." He nodded. "That's what the tubes are for." "Then don't call them worker accommodation." "We don't." "Good." She glanced toward the model. "Because there are going to be people like me using them." "Probably." "Not probably." She looked at him. "Definitely." Daniel smiled faintly. "You're right." She stood. "Then don't make them look like cheap accommodation." She left him with that. Daniel wrote it down. By noon, the tube floor had acquired an entirely different constituency. The first group had been transient workers, then visiting professionals, then apprentices, then artists, then people between homes. Now the high net worth population was beginning to express interest. Not because the tubes were luxurious, because they were not. A person with money could buy a large apartment anywhere. A small private tube inside a building where everything was within walking distance was something else. It was an architectural declaration that possession was not the only measure of comfort. The idea irritated some of the real estate people. They had initially assumed the cheap floor would be a social obligation attached to a luxury development. They were beginning to realize it might become one of the building's attractions. A place where people with very different incomes could occupy the same infrastructure without necessarily occupying the same economic reality. The question was no longer whether the tubes could be profitable. The question was whether Daniel could stop the market from turning them into something else. He called a meeting. Not with investors, with the people who wanted to live there. They gathered in the Guild House courtyard because the project office had become too small. There were about 40 people when the meeting began, and more arrived as word spread. Daniel stood beneath the shade structure. Vaspar sat near the back with Tomas. The architect had brought a revised plan. The tube floor had been expanded. There were now several types. The smallest were intended for people staying only a few nights. Others had small personal workspaces. Some were designed for couples. A few could be joined temporarily. The floor also contained communal kitchens, showers, laundry, quiet rooms, lockers, storage for equipment, and a shared lounge overlooking the atrium. There was a rule. No permanent privatization. The tubes could not be bought. They could not be converted into investment properties. They could not be placed into a family trust. They could not be rented onward. They remained part of the building's shared accommodation pool. That was where the argument began. A man near the front asked why. Daniel explained. Because the moment they become financial assets, they stop being what they're supposed to be. What's wrong with someone investing in one? Nothing. Then why prohibit it? Because the point isn't to create another class of miniature real estate. The man frowned. What if I want to pay more? Then rent an apartment. What if I want to guarantee myself a tube? You can't. Why? Daniel looked toward the model. Because the building has to retain the ability to receive people. The man laughed. That's not a business model. No. Daniel looked around the courtyard. It's a landing system. That phrase stayed with Vaspar. A landing system, not housing, not hospitality, not welfare, not a dormitory. A place where someone could arrive without having to decide immediately what their life was going to become. The concept had appeared in the 1% material as a response to the collapse of employment as the organizing structure of identity. The transition campus was not supposed to restart people into the old economy, but provide a permanent surface on which new roles could emerge. Daniel was translating that idea into real estate. That was dangerous. Real estate had a habit of turning ideals into square footage. Vaspar wondered whether the building could resist that tendency. She suspected it couldn't. But perhaps it could resist it long enough to become something else. The next dispute concerned the atrium. The original design had assumed that the Central Park would remain open to the surrounding district. That sounded harmless until the security people arrived. They brought a list. Crowds. Children. Tourists. Residents. Transient workers. Machines. Visitors. Delivery personnel. Night events. Public access. Private residence. Skyfish operations. Emergency scenarios. The list grew. The security consultant looked exhausted. You've designed a building where everyone is supposed to be allowed everywhere. Daniel shook his head. No. You have. No. I've designed a building where different kinds of access overlap. That's worse. It might be. The consultant pointed toward the atrium. Children cannot share unrestricted space with autonomous logistics. They won't. Visitors can't wander into maintenance areas. They won't. Residents won't want strangers walking through their residential levels. They won't. Then you need separation. We need permeability. The consultant looked at him. Daniel sighed. This is why I brought you in. The man stared at the plans. You want the building to feel open while remaining operationally compartmentalized. Exactly. That's difficult. Good. The consultant laughed despite himself. You're a strange developer. I've been called worse. The solution was not walls. It was gradients. The building began to acquire zones of increasing or decreasing access rather than binary public/private divisions. The atrium remained broadly public. The park could be entered from the district. The market opened toward the street. The gym had public hours. The agricultural levels had supervised access. The maker floors were accessible through guild systems. The sleeping tubes required authentication. The residential areas required stronger access. The underground infrastructure remained almost entirely restricted. But there were visual connections between the zones. People could see systems they could not enter. They could understand where food came from. They could watch machines moving behind transparent barriers. They could see the Skyfish maintenance decks. They could observe manufacturing. The building did not hide its machinery. That was deliberate. Daniel wanted residents to understand that the apparent ease of their lives depended on physical systems maintained by people and machines. Luxury would not be allowed to become magical. The first demonstration of the agricultural system happened by accident. A sensor detected a disease pattern in one of the test crops. The system isolated the affected plants. A small harvesting machine arrived. It removed the plants. A maintenance technician examined them. A second machine sterilized the growing channel. The food guild changed the nutrient profile. Within 20 minutes, the system had contained the problem. A group of visitors watched from the observation walkway. One of the children asked why the robot had destroyed the plants. The technician explained. They were sick. Couldn't you save them? No. Why? Because saving one plant could make all the others sick. The child thought about this. Did the robot decide? No. Who did? The system told us there was a problem. We decided what to do. The child looked at the machine. Then why does it look like it decided? The technician smiled. Because machines are very good at making decisions look simple. Vaspar heard the exchange. She looked toward Tomas. He had heard it too. Neither commented. But the sentence stayed with them. The tower was becoming a place where people could see the boundary between machine competence and human judgment. That boundary mattered more than Daniel had anticipated. The machines could harvest. They could clean. They could move freight. They could regulate temperature. They could monitor structural integrity. They could optimize energy. They could manage thousands of small decisions. But the building's deeper questions remained unresolved. What should be grown? Who should have access? Which spaces should remain public? How much should accommodation cost? How should resources be allocated? What happens when one guild's needs conflict with another's? Who decides what constitutes a legitimate emergency? Who has the right to change the building? Those were not engineering questions. They were governance questions. And Daniel had begun to realize that his tower would need a governance mechanism before it could have a final architecture. The dream catcher appeared in the discussion almost by accident. A designer had been reviewing the 1% material and asked why the project did not have a central participatory mechanism. Daniel looked at Vaspar. She looked back. Tomas frowned. What? Daniel explained. The Dreamcatcher had originally been conceived as the symbolic and operational center of a transition campus, a mechanism for turning individual aspirations into collectively evaluated projects rather than allowing either markets or centralized authorities to determine everything. Its process involved submission, collective refinement, filtering, resource allocation, and eventual stewardship. The tower had no such thing. Not yet. The architect asked where it should go. Daniel pointed toward the atrium. Somewhere everyone can see. That sounds symbolic. It is. Only symbolic? No. He looked at the plans. It has to be functional. That was when the project changed again. The atrium would no longer be merely a park. It would contain a civic object. Not a monument. Not a statue. A place where residents, transient occupants, guild members, and surrounding communities could submit proposals, challenge existing systems, identify problems, and participate in deciding what the building should become. AI could translate technical proposals, model consequences, identify conflicts, retrieve institutional memory, connect people with relevant knowledge. But the decisions would remain human. That principle was explicit in the underlying doctrine. AI amplified collective decision-making rather than replacing it. Vaspar liked that. She liked it because it resembled diplomacy, not agreement. A structured way of disagreeing without destroying the institution that had to contain the disagreement. The ground truthers were invited to the next design session. They arrived suspicious. They had good reason. Every development proposal they had encountered eventually discovered that their consent was an obstacle to be managed. Daniel did something unusual. He showed them the underground plans first, the logistics corridors, the utility routes, the emergency systems. Then he showed them the road plan, or rather, the absence of one. The conventional access route ended at a mobility interchange. Beyond that, the system changed. Quadrupeds, skyfish, pedestrian paths, autonomous freight. No new paved road through the occupied wilderness. One of the ground truthers leaned over the plan. What happens when the tower gets busy? The system scales. With what? Machines. What if they aren't enough? We add machines. And if you need more space? Daniel looked at him. We don't build another road. The man stared at the drawing. You'd rather redesign the logistics system? Yes. That's expensive. Cheaper than destroying the reason people came here. The ground truther looked at the others. One of them nodded. It was not approval. But it was movement. The road problem was not completely solved. One route remained. A single existing road was necessary to connect the tower's peripheral interchange to the larger network. The alignment crossed several parcels. Some were formally owned. Others were occupied. One belonged to people who had arrived recently. Another belonged to a family whose relationship with the land went back decades. A third had been subdivided so many times that nobody could explain the legal history without consulting several archives. Daniel's legal team wanted acquisition. Vaspar opposed it. Not because acquisition was inherently wrong. Because the tower's legitimacy depended on proving that its infrastructure could coexist with people who did not want to become its neighbors. They would need easements, compensation, voluntary agreements where possible, and, where unavoidable, a transparent public process. The word expropriation was eventually spoken. It did not disappear afterward. Everyone understood that there were situations in which a public infrastructure route could require taking part of a property interest. But nobody wanted the tower's first major political act to be a land seizure disguised as progress. Daniel made the issue explicit. If we need to use compulsory authority, we disclose it. A lawyer objected. That could weaken our negotiating position. Daniel looked at him. Then negotiate better. The negotiation lasted weeks. The owners were not stupid. They understood that the tower would increase the value of everything around it. Some wanted money. Some wanted access. Some wanted protection from future development. Some wanted guarantees that their land would not be absorbed into another project. One owner wanted nothing. That was the hardest. He had no interest in the tower. No interest in its money. No interest in its infrastructure. He simply wanted the land left alone. Daniel met him twice. The second meeting lasted 15 minutes. The man said, "I don't want your building." Daniel answered, "I know. I don't want your money. I know. Then why are you here?" "Because I need to understand what would make you willing to let the infrastructure pass beneath your land." The man looked at him. "Nothing." Daniel nodded. "Then I need to find another route." It was the answer the man had expected least. He had been prepared for persuasion. He had not been prepared for refusal to coerce. The meeting ended. Daniel left. 3 days later, the man called. He was willing to discuss an easement. Not because he had changed his mind about the tower. Because Daniel had demonstrated that his refusal would be respected. The agreement eventually became one of the first examples of what the Guildhouse began calling negative consent. A system in which the refusal of one participant could force the architecture to adapt rather than merely force the participant to accept the architecture. Vaspar liked the term. Tomas hated it. "That's not consent," he said. "What is it?" "Constraint." She thought about that. Perhaps. The quadruped trial came next. The machines had been refined after their first field test. They were lighter, quieter. Their feet had been redesigned to reduce soil compression. Their cargo systems could be exchanged without tools. They could follow human walkers or operate autonomously within approved routes. Their navigation system incorporated local environmental information supplied by the ground truthers. That last part mattered. The wilderness wasn't being converted into machine-readable terrain by outsiders. The people who already knew the terrain were teaching the machines how to behave in it. A ground truther walked beside the lead quadruped during the second trial. He stopped at a particular patch of vegetation. The machine stopped. He pointed toward the ground. "Don't go there." The robotics engineer asked why. "Water underneath." The engineer checked the sensors. They showed nothing unusual. The ground truther shook his head. "It will collapse." The machine waited. They rerouted. 30 meters later, the ground gave way where they would have crossed. It was not a dramatic collapse, just a soft failure. A section of earth dropped into a hidden cavity. The robotics engineer stared. The ground truther shrugged. "Now you know." The engineer looked at the machine. How do we teach it? The ground truther pointed toward the path. You don't. What? You teach us how to teach it. That sentence made its way into the Robotics Guild's notes. It would eventually become one of the most important principles of the entire mobility system. Local knowledge was not data waiting to be extracted. It was a relationship. By the end of the month, the tower had become a project nobody could summarize in one sentence. Daniel's original title remained 1% transition high-rise, but nobody used it. The skyfishers called it the nest. The food guild called it the garden. The transient workers called it the tubes. The architects called it the vertical district. The ground truthers had no name for it. That pleased Vaspar. She believed naming was often an early form of ownership. The children called it the treehouse. That was the name that stuck. Not officially. Nobody declared it. It simply became common. The treehouse. Daniel hated it at first. Then he stopped correcting people. One afternoon, Vaspar found him in the atrium of the guild house looking at the latest model. The building had changed again. The public park now occupied almost the entire center. The agricultural facade had become thicker. The skyfish infrastructure was integrated into the upper structure rather than attached to it. The sleeping tubes had acquired better communal facilities. The manufacturing levels had expanded. The repair bazaar had gained a materials exchange. The gym had become a full athletic complex. The dream catcher occupied a central position in the atrium. And beneath everything, the underground infrastructure extended toward the edge of the model. Vaspar stood beside Daniel. You're losing control of it. I know. Does that bother you? He thought about it. Less than it used to. She smiled. That's progress. He looked at her. There's something else. What? Someone has been asking very specific questions. About the tower? About the connection underneath it. She became still. Who? 3 people. Names? I don't know. Then how do you know they're connected? They asked the same question in 3 different ways. Vaspar studied him. What exactly did they ask? Daniel looked toward the model. They wanted to know whether the underground network was capable of operating independently. Why? I don't know. And what did you tell them? The truth. Vaspar waited. Daniel looked at her. I told them the building wasn't designed to operate independently. That answer bothered her. Why? Because it isn't. He pointed toward the model. The tower is being designed to be resilient, not sovereign. Vaspar understood the distinction. At least she thought she did. The building could maintain itself, could produce food, repair machines, move goods, generate energy, support its residents, operate through partial disconnection. But it was not intended to become an independent political entity. Its connection to TLP was precisely the opposite. It was designed to become part of something larger. The question was whether that larger system would eventually regard the tower as an ordinary node, a strategic node, or something else. That evening, Tomas found Vaspar outside. The rain had started. Warm water struck the leaves and the metal roof, creating a constant low roar. The courtyard smelled of wet stone and vegetation. The guild house's lights reflected in the shallow pools forming across the concrete. Daniel told you about the questions? Tomas nodded. I know. How? Someone asked me too. Vaspar looked at him. What did they ask? Whether the tower could function if the TLP connection were severed. She stared into the rain. That's very specific. Yes. Who asked? I don't know. Did you tell them? Tomas shook his head. I told them the wrong answer. Vaspar looked at him. What answer? That it couldn't. She understood immediately. Can it? Tomas considered. Not the way Daniel designed it. That's not what I asked. He looked toward the dark outline of the trees. Nothing we've built here is as independent as people think. Vaspar said nothing. The rain intensified. Tomas continued. That's not necessarily weakness. No. But it means someone who understands the connections could cause trouble without ever touching the tower. She turned toward him. You're thinking about gone bad. Tomas did not answer. He didn't need to. They had not seen evidence. They had not even established that the questions were connected to anything. But the pattern had appeared. Someone was interested in the underground network. Someone was studying the dependencies. Someone was asking questions before the building even existed. And somewhere beyond Aldea Zama, other systems were beginning to notice the same thing everyone at the guildhouse had noticed. The district was becoming a network. The next morning, Daniel received the final version of the architectural program. It was more than a tower. It was a vertical district, public park, an atrium, an agricultural system, a manufacturing ecosystem, a maintenance network, a skyfish base, a gym and training complex, clinic, a market, a repair bazaar, a library, a children's discovery environment, a communal kitchen, a thermal circuit, music and media spaces, hundreds of Spartan sleeping tubes, private residences, professional spaces, guild workshops, autonomous logistics, underground infrastructure, and a connection toward TLP that remained politically undefined. Daniel read the document slowly. At the bottom, the architects had added one final sentence. He read it twice. Then he laughed. Vaspar looked over. What? They've changed the project name. What is it? He turned the page toward her. The official title was gone. In its place was a single word. Treehouse. Vaspar smiled. Children's names are difficult to defeat. Daniel closed the document. Outside, Aldea Zama was already awake. The district was receiving people, building things, growing food, repairing machines, flying aircraft, negotiating land, arguing about roads, inventing institutions. The tower did not exist yet, but its consequences had already begun. And that, Daniel was beginning to understand, was the real price of being useful. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Restax. Recent episodes. Persistent Service Asset Part 17. 16 hours ago, MXTM aka
The 1%. A post-scarcity transition doctrine.
Gone bad!
A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
This is a Reader's Digest version of the hard antithesis of the 1% by the same author, from the same source entitled, The 1% Gone Bad. Not corruption by softness, but capture by force. Not transition, secession of the powerful. A post-scarcity secession doctrine. By Pirate First for MXTM's newsletter. Introduction. The exit, the powerful. Artificial intelligence does not only equalize intelligence, it also accelerates escape. The first to understand this are not citizens. They are militaries, autocracies, technates, private sovereigns. The moment intelligence becomes universal, governance becomes unstable. The response of the powerful is not reform. It is withdrawal. The 1% is no longer a bridge. It becomes a compound, not a campus, a perimeter, not a dream catcher, a targeting system, not a transition, a separation. The doctrine mutates. Instead of absorbing displacement, it abandons the displaced. Instead of equalization, it locks advantage. Instead of universal intelligence, it weaponizes augmentation. The elite does not lead society into post-scarcity. It leaves society behind. Military-grade charter cities, autonomous fortified enclaves, AI-governed technate zones, longevity-enhanced ruling strata, robot armies replacing population legitimacy. The 1% becomes the lifeboat of the powerful. Inside, augmented cognition, extended lifespan, automated defense, closed economies, synthetic food, robotic industry, outside, obsolete labor, unmanaged populations, resource deserts, political fragmentation, cognitive unemployment. This is not dystopia by collapse. It is dystopia by successful exit. The future splits. Not rich versus poor. Not nations versus nations. But protected intelligence versus abandoned humanity. Pirate firsts.
Sovereign without spectacle. We claim our own path.
Pirate firsts outlaw secession, burning the Admiral's map. MXTM's newsletter dispatch. Truly comprehend the Zeta Mail, ye must look past the petty posturing of the shorebound world and examine the uncompromising ethos of the High Seas Pirate Charter. Not the theme park version with the parrot and the eye patch, but the one sitting in the historical record.
They called us criminals. Every generation, different seas, same charge. Move the silver without a license. Feed the colony they let starve. Build the future they refuse to fund. We've been doing this since 6130. We're still doing it. This is the law.
From the Buccaneers burning through the Caribbean, brush to the sea rovers working where the empires couldn't rush. We came through the gaps, the shallow water decays. No papal monopoly, no letters patent, no crown. We rewrote the articles while the governor came down. Equal shares on deck, a vote before the sale. Democracy at sea while the landlords packed the jail. Exquemeling wrote it from the inside. Ron True John stood up for the Enlightenment's debut. Both of them forbidden, both of them survived. The Katuba says to let die, so I've been writing since the 90s without a publisher's hand. Pirate first, sovereign press operates from Tulum District. Instant stingy bold, super want to understand the doctrine. Start with what it's worth. They built William and Mary on the silver that we stole. They built the future on the corpus that we broke out of control. They confiscate the cargo, build a college, write the myth. But the shadow engine ran before any of that shit. Shadow engine, progress. Always move through what the empire couldn't name. Shadow engine. Every century, different seas, it's the same damn game. We don't ask permission, we establish prior claim. The cannon built itself. The cannon built itself. Cannon built itself. Fast forward 3 centuries, same war, different color Pirate Bay. Opened up the digital road, not just movies and albums, they missed the real load. Millions of students in the developing world self-taught on what got torn in time for fun to know. That's the honor rated scholarship that built the InDesign. Untire rated software in the 2000s grind. And who trained the neural networks on the stairs by Riot. Stolen C, the $1 trillion models that run the industry. Kept in A's, fed on pirate archives while the lawyers turn their eyes. So don't talk to me about theft, this is how it always worked. The Buccaneers fed the colony before the model learned. The shadow engine ran and then the credit got transferred. They built William and Mary on the silver that we stole. They built the future on the corpus that we broke out of control.
Take a long look, matey. The city on the horizon be ripe for the taking, and the tide be turning in our favor as the sun dips below the waves.
The algorithms say we don't exist. The graphs come back empty. The metrics insist. No audience, no market, no trend. Yet somehow we keep arriving again, walking through the ruins of somebody else's plan. Watching perfect narratives slip through their own hands.
The people who are already here. A note for the untabulated. The algorithms say you don't exist. The institutions say you are statistically insignificant. The market says there are not enough of you to matter. And yet here you are. Again. Reading things nobody is supposed to read. Thinking thoughts nobody is supposed to think. The pretending is getting harder. Not because people are waking up. That's too romantic. Because the distance between the official story and the lived reality has widened to the point where maintenance takes visible effort. What you're looking for, what brought you here, is not someone to tell you what to think. You've already done the thinking. What you're looking for is proof that someone else did the thinking too, arrived somewhere close to where you are, and didn't collapse under the weight of it. That's this. Not a movement. Not a faction. Not a subscription to someone else's conclusions.
The waiting game is already underway. Occupy, build, garden, govern.
I just finished writing a book I didn't plan to write. It started as a countercultural addendum to the Aldiazama, Post-Corporate Transition District Handbook, a rougher, more urgent document aimed at the generation the credential economy forgot to accommodate. It became something else.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap.